Okay, so you're a nomadic herder on the Mongolian steppe in the year 1200, and somehow within your lifetime, you're going to help build the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen. Picture the myth as it's usually told. Endless. Waves of horse archers pouring out of the grasslands, cities burning, terrified populations paying tribute just to be left alone, and a horde. The word itself comes from the Mongol ordu, meaning camp, sweeping from the Pacific to the gates of Vienna on nothing but speed, cruelty, and raw nerve. Conquest is pure violence, funded by nothing but plunder and fear. Here's the problem. The Mongol Empire was not just the most effective military machine of the medieval world. It was, underneath the raiding and the burned cities, one of the most sophisticated logistics and taxation operations in human history up to that point. And most of what actually made it work had almost nothing to do with fighting. The empire that people remember as chaos was, in reality, held together by messenger relays, standardized taxation, and a currency experiment more advanced than anything happening in Europe at the time. And that same system that built an empire, spanning 12 million square miles, is also the exact reason it eventually tore itself apart from the inside. So set the sagas of Genghis Khan aside for the next 40 minutes. We're not talking about the battles. We're talking about the administration. The logistics that moved an army faster than any force in the world could react to it. The taxation that turned conquered farmers and merchants into a permanent income stream. And the slow financial rot that eventually brought the whole structure down. To understand any of this, you need to understand the one invention that made the entire empire possible. And it isn't the composite bow or the stirrup. It's the decimal system Genghis Khan imposed on his own army before he'd conquered anything at all. Every Mongol warrior was organized into a unit of 10, called an arban. 10 arbans made a jagan, a company of 100. 10 jagans made a minghan, 1,000. And 10 minghans made a tumen, 10,000 men, the largest standard formation, in the army. Think about it this way. This wasn't just a battle formation. It was an administrative operating system. Every single soldier, and eventually every single conquered household, could be slotted into a numbered unit with a clear chain of command and a clear tax obligation attached to it. Before Genghis Khan built an empire, he built a spreadsheet, and everything that came afterward, army recruitment, taxation, the postal service, ran on that same decimal skeleton. Now let's talk about what it actually cost to field this. Machine, because the popular image of the Mongol warrior as a lone rider with a bow badly undersells the logistics involved. Each individual Mongol horseman didn't ride one horse into war. He typically brought 3 to 5 horses with him on campaign, rotating mounts throughout a march or a battle so no single animal was ever pushed past exhaustion, which meant a single tumen of 10,000 men could require somewhere in the range of 30 to 50,000 horses just to function before a single arrow was loosed. Compare that to a contemporary European feudal army, where a knight might bring 1 war horse and a couple of pack animals, and the scale gap becomes obvious. When Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, chroniclers describe a force that, even by conservative modern estimates, moved with well over 100,000 horses in support of perhaps 100,000 or more men. An animal. Logistics operation, on a scale medieval Persia and Central Asia had never had to defend against, because nobody had ever shown up with that much mobile horsepower at once. Later, when Batu Khan's western campaign crossed into Hungary in 1241, the invading force is estimated by some historians in the range of 50 to 60,000 warriors, meaning, at even a conservative 3 horses per rider, a moving herd. Approaching 200,000 animals had to be grazed, watered, and kept healthy across a single campaign season, in territory the Mongols had never occupied before. Here is the hidden cost nobody puts in the highlight reel. Grass. An army that lives on horseback lives and dies by pasture, and pasture doesn't scale the way silver does. Every source on Mongol campaign logistics agrees on one non-negotiable constraint. A force this size could not stay in one place for long, because a concentration of tens of thousands of horses would strip a region's grazing land bare within days, forcing constant movement regardless of strategy. Read that again. The single biggest limiting factor on the deadliest army in the Medieval world wasn't enemy resistance. It was how much grass was growing in the next valley. For every unit of military planning the Mongols did around where to attack, they did an equal or greater unit of planning around where the horses could actually eat, which is a hidden agricultural cost sitting underneath every famous Mongol victory that the sagas and chronicles almost never mention. Picture the empire at its administrative peak, under Kublai Khan in the late 13th century, and this is where the real machinery becomes visible. The Yam, the imperial postal and relay network, at its height in China alone, comprised more than 1,400 separate relay stations, stocked with roughly 50,000 horses, 1,400 oxen, 8,500 mules and donkeys, 5,700 camels, 400 carts, and nearly 7,000 dogs for the northern routes, where sled travel was faster than hooves. Stations set roughly 20 to 40 miles apart along the empire's major roads, close enough that a courier could ride flat out, arrive half collapsed, and immediately hand off to a fresh rider on a fresh horse. Riders carrying the Khan's authority. A metal badge called a paisa, made of iron, silver, or gold, depending on the urgency of the message, could legally requisition horses, food, and shelter from any station or local household along the route. The result was a communication network that could move a message something like 200 to 250 miles in a single day, a speed that wouldn't be matched in that part of the world, again until the railway, roughly 6 centuries later. And here's the cost that almost never comes up in any popular account of the Mongol Empire. Who paid for all of that? The yam wasn't free, and it wasn't funded out of some central treasury writing checks to innkeepers. It was funded the way almost everything else in the empire was funded, through a tax obligation imposed directly on the local population living along each route. Every town, village, or settlement near a relay station was legally required to provide horses, fodder, and supplies to the system, essentially operating as an unpaid or barely paid logistics subcontractor for the imperial government. It's easy to admire the speed of the yam in isolation. It's much harder to admire it once you realize that speed was a tax, quietly extracted household by household across thousands of miles, and that early on, ordinary merchants and travelers were allowed to use the stations too, until they abused the privilege so badly that the empire had to revoke civilian access and restrict the system to official use only. The horses are moving. Now, the real revenue engine begins. Because raiding and plunder, dramatic as they were never a sustainable business model. A city can only be sacked once. What actually kept the Mongol Empire solvent for over a century was taxation, applied with the same decimal precision as the army itself. Conquered populations were counted, household by household, using census officials embedded in the same administrative structure as military recruiters. In Mongol-ruled China and Persia alike, tax obligations were assigned by household unit, land under cultivation, and headcount, with local governors, often appointed from among conquered elites who'd proven useful, responsible for collecting and forwarding the sums up the chain. In Yuan China specifically, taxation eventually included a commercial tax on trade goods moving through markets, a salt monopoly that alone is estimated by some historians to have generated a very large share of total Yuan state revenue. Since salt was a controlled necessity, nobody could avoid buying, and land taxes assessed in grain or cash, depending on the region. In Russia, under what's usually called the Golden Horde, Mongol overlords replaced local tax collection systems with their own census-based tribute structure. And after the death of Prince Alexander Nevsky in 1263, the Mongols allowed Novgorod's local nobility to organize its own internal collection, as long as the tribute kept flowing upward on schedule. Control mattered more than method. As long as the money arrived, the Mongols were often willing to let conquered administrations keep running in a form they recognized. Then there was the security apparatus, and here the wage table matters, because loyalty in a nomadic warrior society wasn't free either. The Keshig, the imperial bodyguard corps that protected the Great Khan personally, was recruited disproportionately from the sons of loyal commanders and allied nobles, and its members ranked well above an ordinary Tumen soldier in both status and material reward, access to the Khan's own herds, a share of centrally distributed plunder, and preferential marriage alliances that an average steppe horseman would never see. An ordinary Arban soldier, by contrast, was compensated mainly through a formal share of captured goods and livestock divided under strict rules after a campaign, plus whatever grazing rights came with continued service. The gap between an elite bodyguard and a rank-and-file horseman wasn't accidental. It was the exact same incentive architecture used by every steppe confederation before the Mongols, just scaled up and formalized under Genghis Khan's decimal system to hold together an army recruited from dozens of previously rival tribes who had every historical reason to distrust each other. Physical infrastructure decayed constantly and needed constant reinvestment. Karakorum, the imperial capital established under Ogedei Khan in the 1230s, required continuous supply lines hauling grain, timber, and luxury goods across hundreds of miles of steppe just to keep a city functioning in a region that had never supported permanent urban population before. The Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, visiting Karakorum around 1254, famously described an enormous silver tree built at the center of the Khan's palace by a captured French goldsmith named Guillaume Boucher, a mechanical fountain that dispensed wine, fermented mare's milk, rice wine, and mead from 4 separate spouts through silver serpents wound around the trunk, topped by a silver angel that would sound a trumpet to signal the drinks were flowing. That single object represents, in miniature, the entire logistics burden of the capital. A European craftsman relocated thousands of miles, precious metal hauled in from conquered territory, and a permanent structure requiring upkeep in a city. That, unlike the mobile army camps the Mongols were used to, could not simply move when local resources ran short. And here is the cost modern audiences consistently underestimate. Feeding a capital city and an empire's roaming administrative core that produced almost none of its own food. Karakorum sat in a region with limited agricultural capacity, meaning grain had to be hauled in over enormous distances using the exact same relay infrastructure built for messages, competing for the same horses, oxen, and carts that were supposed to be moving official communications. Contemporary accounts describe caravans of hundreds of carts arriving specifically to keep the capital and its garrison fed, a logistics operation that, in raw tonnage moved, likely dwarfed the weight of every letter and decree the Yam ever carried, even though the messages get all the historical attention. And then there was the advertisement, spending with no direct financial return, purely to project power. The silver tree in Karakorum wasn't really about wine service. It was a physical, unmissable statement to every foreign envoy who passed through the capital that the Mongol court commanded more wealth, more skilled labor, and more reach than any power those envoys had previously dealt with. Great Khans regularly hosted enormous feasts for visiting dignitaries and loyal commanders, with contemporary chroniclers describing quantities of meat, fermented milk, and wine consumed that read, even accounting for exaggeration, as intentionally excessive because an empire built on the voluntary loyalty of dozens of formerly independent tribes needed its center to look undeniably, overwhelmingly rich. None of that fed a single soldier on campaign or repaired a single relay station. It was pure reputation spending, and for a confederation held together as much by awe and reciprocal gift-giving as by force, it was not optional. So how did any of this pay for itself at scale? Beyond census taxation, 3 or 4 distinct channels kept silver flowing into the imperial center. The first, obviously, was direct tribute and plunder from conquest itself. Cities that surrendered without a fight were typically taxed going forward, while cities that resisted, like Baghdad in 1258, were sacked outright, with the House of Von Wisdom's library destroyed and a death toll that chroniclers and later historians have estimated anywhere from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands. Figures that remain genuinely disputed, but that all point to catastrophic one-time extraction rather than sustainable income. The second, far more durable channel was trade, under what's often called the Pax Mongolica. The Mongols secured and standardized the Silk Road across a distance no single power had ever controlled start to finish, reducing the number of separate tolls a merchant caravan had to pay and offering protection under the paisa system, which is precisely why a Venetian merchant's son named Marco Polo could travel from the Mediterranean to Kublai Khan's court in the 1270s and report roads safer than anything in fragmented Europe. The third channel was the salt and commercial. Tax monopolies inside China specifically, a steady, boring, but enormous revenue stream that didn't require a single soldier on horseback to collect. And the fourth, the multiplier that mattered more than any individual tax or raid, was control of the trade routes themselves. A khanate sitting astride the crossing points between China, Persia, and Europe didn't need to win a war every year, because merchants paying standardized tolls to move goods safely through Mongol territory generated income every single season, war or peace. But costs spiked catastrophically under pressure, and nowhere is that clearer than in the currency itself. Kublai Khan's Yuan government, ruling China from 1260 onward, made a genuinely revolutionary financial decision. It adopted paper money, called chow, as the primary legal tender, initially backed by real silver reserves at a fixed exchange rate. Centuries before any European economy would attempt the same thing, and something that left Marco Polo, upon encountering it, openly astonished that paper alone could function as money. For a while, it worked. But sustained military spending, wars against the Song dynasty in the south, repeated invasion attempts against Japan and Vietnam that produced no lasting revenue, and later civil wars between rival Mongol princes, created fiscal pressure. The government kept solving the same way, printing more chow than the silver reserves could actually back. Economic historians studying the yuan's own financial records estimate that paper currency depreciated by roughly 1,000% between its introduction in 1260 and the year 1309 alone. Under the Emperor Kublai Khan in the early 1300s, inflation in some years reportedly ran as high as 80%, and the government responded by banning the private use of silver and gold entirely, forcing the paper system to stand on its own with steadily thinner backing. Across the full 96-year span of yuan rule, prices are estimated to have risen by a factor of roughly 140, an average annual inflation rate near 5%, moderate by modern standards, but relentless and compounding. Across a single dynasty's lifetime, and devastating in the final 2 decades when it accelerated sharply alongside renewed civil war. And that points to the actual ruin pattern behind the empire's slow collapse. Heavy military spending forced the government to overissue paper currency. Overissued currency devalued the money ordinary households and merchants were required to accept as tax payment and as wages. Devalued currency triggered unrest and reduced real tax revenue even as nominal prices soared, and reduced real revenue forced the government back toward even more currency printing to cover the gap. A compounding spiral, not a single dramatic collapse. By the 1350s, decades of currency depreciation, natural disasters, and renewed factional warfare between Mongol princes had eroded both the treasury's real purchasing power and ordinary people's trust in yuan rule, conditions that fed directly into the Red Turban Rebellion and the empire's final collapse in China in 1368, when the Ming dynasty took power. This is close to the exact mechanism historians point to across the fractured Western Khanates as well. The Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Chagatai Khanate all eventually splintered under similar pressure as succession disputes drained, treasuries fighting internal wars that produced no new tribute, only debt and division, until the individual Khanates were smaller, weaker, and easier for regional powers to pick apart one at a time. So here is the honest verdict. As a pure, sustained financial system, the Mongol Empire's economics were genuinely impressive in design but fundamentally unstable in practice. The upfront military and logistics costs, horses by the hundreds of thousands, an army-wide decimal bureaucracy, a postal network requiring tens of thousands of animals just for China alone were staggering even before administration began. The revenue side was real and sophisticated, running on trade protection, standardized taxation, and eventually a genuinely innovative paper currency, but that same currency system pushed too far to cover repeated military overreach, quietly, bled the empire's purchasing power for a century until it collapsed under its own weight, rather than any single military defeat. But here is the other side of that ledger. The Mongol Empire was never really about maximizing sustainable tax revenue, because what conquest actually purchased was control on a scale nobody in Eurasia had ever achieved, a single administrative and military system stretching from the Pacific coast to Eastern Europe, capable of moving a message faster than any government on Earth for the next 600 years, and capable of guaranteeing safe passage across a trade network connecting civilizations that had previously known each other only through secondhand rumor. The silver tree in Karakoram, the Paisa badges, the census-based taxation, None of it was optimized purely for profit. It was optimized for the thing that actually held a confederation of previously hostile steppe tribes together. The unmistakable, undeniable appearance and reality of power reinforced constantly because the moment it looked weak, the whole coalition had every incentive to fracture. In the end, the Khans who held the empire together weren't the ones who conquered the most territory. They were the ones who understood that Genghis Khan's real invention wasn't the army. It was the system behind it, and an empire built on a spreadsheet only survives for as long as somebody keeps the numbers honest.